Hi, folks. This is Dr. DiBiase, and this is our unit on literacies and their sponsors. And I'm going to be giving you a quick unit overview. So, what I'll be doing today is sort of outlining some of the big questions we're going to be asking and some of our major goals for the unit to get us started thinking about the issues that we'll be talking about. I will acknowledge upfront that I'm a little bit biased. This week and next week are kind of my two favorite pieces of content for the course. In terms of the readings and issues we're going to be exploring. So bear with my enthusiasm as we make our way through it. So last week we really talked about process and revision. We talked about Lamont and how all writers benefit from a process approach. And thinking about Nancy Summers' piece helped us really think about different ways to think about what process looks like and what revision looks like more specifically. And now we're going to be moving on out of the context of process and moving into the context of literacies. So what does that mean? Well, if we think about process, right, our process comes from somewhere. Through some way, shape, or form, we arrived at the relationship to writing that we have. And so we might talk about composing as one kind of a broader literacy practice. And one of the things that we can begin to ask is, again, where do those processes come from? And that's a small question we're going to be talking about, but it's part of the bigger question, right? How do we develop the literacy practices that we develop? And a key term that we're going to be using over the next couple of weeks is the idea of something being situated, right? To exist within a larger environment, system, or context. And so what we're going to talk about, particularly with respect to this particular unit, is that our literacy practices, our writing practices, our reading practices, our composing practices don't just exist in a vacuum. They are situated in a larger context that includes our political reality, our economic reality, our cultural reality, among other things. And so we're going to dive into what that might mean for making sense of what we talk about when we talk about literacy. So here are some of the big questions that we're going to be asking with respect to this threshold concept, right? The importance of previous experiences. So first, here's the big one, right? What is literacy, right? How do we define what it means to be a literate individual or to possess literacy, assuming literacy is something that one can actually possess, right? Is literacy singular, right? Is there a single kind of literacy? And I'll give you a spoiler alert here. No, it's not, right? We're going to talk about how literacy can take various shapes and how that there are different kinds of literacies that we acquire and participate in. How do definitions of literacy change over time? So one of the things that I'm going to be asking you to do to kick off this week is in your group discussions to think about what does it mean at this present moment to be a literate individual, right? What makes someone literate, or what are the qualities that would lead someone to be recognized by another person as being a literate individual? And we'll think about how our conception of that shifts over the course of this week and even next week. We'll think about how do we gain access to literacy or literacies, right? How does one come into being a literate individual, right? What are the things that shape your ability to cultivate the sets of practices that mark one as being literate? What are the broader social, political, cultural, and economic factors that determine the value of a given literacy? This is going to be really important in the context of our very first major reading of this unit that you'll kind of kick off tomorrow with, and maybe even get started with today, but Deborah Brandt's piece on the sponsors of literacy that we can find in Writing About Writing is really critical in terms of asking the question of why are some literacies valued more than others? What are the factors that shape those values? And as I have in the next bullet point, how do those values shift over time and why? So, this is a really simple example, but when I was in, elementary school, we learned how to write in cursive, and my handwriting is terrible, like really, really, really bad. And I would get, poor grades for handwriting, relatively consistently. That is not a skill that has much value right now, right? Like my typing is quite good. I'm a pretty good typer. I don't handwrite very frequently, and in my school, my daughter's kindergarten classes, they're certainly not talking about cursive, but they are talking about how to use a keyboard, right? So certain literacy skills, are given different values over time. And if we can talk about different literacies, carrying different values, then we can ask the question: who benefits from valuing certain literacies over others, and who is harmed, or what communities benefit and what communities are harmed? I want to give you a fair warning for this unit and the unit that's coming up. A number of these readings are tough. I want you to stick with them. I know that you can handle them if you give yourself sufficient time. As we have kind of talked about, right, they're not necessarily going to be written with an undergraduate, first-year undergraduate student in mind. Many of these were published for audiences of other scholars, and so they assume a certain level of base knowledge that you may not have coming into the text. In my videos for the various readings we're going to be looking at, I'm going to be doing my best to provide some of the context that you might need in order to get the most out of that reading before you dive into it. A number of the readings that we're going to look at are going to call into question some of the assumptions that you might have about how literacy works or what literacy is. They should, right? That's the point, right? New scholarship should lead us to kind of question our assumptions, so just be ready for that. And I'll note that a few of the readings might make you feel a little bit uncomfortable, particularly if you come from a background that has benefited by the ways that certain literacies and language practices are valued over others, right? For example, to give you a heads up, Brent is going to make the argument that if you come from a more economically well-off background, then you come into things like schooling with an advantage over those who do not, right? And not because of anything that you personally did, right? So if you are if you are a quote-unquote good writer or you have strong language practices, that is as much a factor of that is as much a result of maybe your own ability or work ethic as it is the fact of the happenstance of your birth and the situation you were sort of born into, or the culture you were born into, or the community that you were born into. And at least one or two of the readings that we engage in are going to propose some ideas about literacy that might strike you as radical or impossible, or at least impractical, right? They might propose solutions to some of the issues that are caused by how we value certain literacies, and you might look at their solutions and say that might not be doable. That may be a fair point, and that's gonna be something that we're going to dive into as we look at those readings. So as I'm saying here, right, the readings might be tough. Welcome to college. I know you can do this.